Okay, welcome to Black Men Speak. I'm your co-host, the J.R. Stewart.
And I'm your co-host, the Tommy D. Duncan III, Jimmy. It is Wednesday, February the 15th, 2023, Jimmy. And if it's Wednesday night,
it's Black Men Speak. So let's take care of some of our business first and get it out of the way. Let's give a big shout out to Liquid for providing our theme music. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and spread the word. Share the information. Invite a guest. If you're here watching, invite a guest to come join you, because this is the most progressive internet media, social media show on the internet dealing with Black issues.
Yes, sir, Jimmy. And we have got another exciting show for everyone tonight, and I am looking forward to it.
Well, Tom, I'm going to do a shameful plug, self-promote plug. The shirt that I'm wearing is one that comes from RM Clothing Company, and that's a company that I started to make fashion for real men. And Tom, this is one of our prototype shirts. I'm happy to say that I finally lost enough weight to be able to fit into my own shirts. I refuse to make anything past a 2X. So, for a long time I was wearing 4 and 5Xs. So I've finally gotten small enough where I can wear my own shirts.
Well, Jimmy, that's a lot of X's, man, but I'm glad you have got it down.
So, Tom, with that being said, the shameful plug out of the way, and the call to attention for everyone to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, or join us through the chat line. Tom, let's get started by introducing our topics for the night. Where are we going to start? I know there's stuff to cover.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff to cover tonight, Jimmy, and we're going to have our Black History Spotlight tonight.
All right.
On the great Frederick Douglas. But in addition to that, folks, we're going to talk about a few folks that we have lost who have transitioned to our ancestors. We're going to talk a little bit about Black families and homeschooling. Interesting news from across the continent. Idris Elba is going to be building a film studio in Ghana. We're going to talk a little bit about Super Bowl 57 and maybe a few other things, Jimmy. But let's start off, of course, still being in February, with our Black History Spotlight. The great Frederick Douglass, probably, Jimmy, one of the most important people in American history and for sure in the 19th century.
Yes, definitely. And if you or your children are not familiar with the body of work from Frederick Douglass, please take a moment out. If you don't do anything else, take some time out to study, read on his body of work and some of the accomplishments that attributed to him. So, Tom, I'm not sure if during that era and maybe throughout American history, if there have been too many who have been greater than Frederick Douglass.
Jimmy, considering the fact that he was born a slave.
Tom.
In the early 1800s, and unfortunately, like a lot of other of our ancestors who were born during that period of time, they don't know exactly when they were born, but people suspect he was born between 1817 or 1818, in Maryland in Talbot County. He literally, when people talk about lifting yourselves up by your bootstraps, that is what he literally did. He self-taught himself.
You can take his picture and put it in a dictionary under how to lift yourself up, or an example of a person who's lifting himself up. Like I said, I don't know if there's any greater lift yourself up by the bootstraps example than Frederick Douglass.
someone who really didn't know his mom because she was sold off to another
Hmm.
plantation, never met his dad, was raised for a period of time by his grandmother, and was fortunate enough to have what I guess what they called a mistress, the slave owner's wife, um, was teaching him ABCs maybe in his around 11 or 12 years old, Jimmy, and found out, of course, that someone being enslaved and having an education is not pretty compatible, and so
Oh no,
she
you could
started.
be killed. That was against the black code at that time. And,
Exactly.
but some slave owners, Tom, would bend the rules a little bit because it was advantageous to them to have a slave that could read a little bit. Um, because sometimes they couldn't read or write very well, and having a slave that could read or write a note for you, and was beneficial at times for at least following directions. But you didn't want all your slaves to be literate, and then you didn't want the ones that could read a little bit to be that literate. So there was a limit to how much you would be willing to teach a slave about reading and certainly about writing. You had to be careful with the writing part because a lot of notes, freedom notes, and passes to move about when you were a slave were just handwritten notes.
You're correct, Jimmy. And he actually tricked some of his young white counterparts who were on the plantation to start saying things and reading, what they were learning in school. And so he, was very smart. I mean, even though he was uneducated at that time as a young boy, he was smart enough to trick some of the other slaveholders' children to teaching him how to read, and so he could learn literacy. And, once from there, that was it. And once he learned that education is the portal to freedom and that there was an incompatibility between education and slavery, Jimmy. That was it. And so he literally self-taught himself how to read, how to write, became one of the most prolific orators in
Right.
American history, was a writer, started his own newspaper, the Black Star, Jimmy, and actually worked himself, absconded from slavery, and was able to get to the North, Jimmy, and built a network from there and was able to get himself purchased out of slavery. And literally, Jimmy, what happened is he started working with the abolitionist movement. And of course, his life was at threat because at that point in time, Jimmy, it doesn't matter where you are in the country.
Well, the fugitive
It
slave laws, Tom, uh,
exactly.
and, and the South was successful, especially the Virginia delegation, into getting that added to the Constitution. Now, many northern states didn't adhere to it. They didn't want to waste their resources, tracking down freed slaves and returning to the South. But that certainly did not stop bounty hunters from going up north, finding a slave, and returning them to the South.
You are correct, Jimmy. And he was able to get out of the South, met the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the white abolitionists who fought on behalf of in freeing our ancestors who were enslaved. He even met John Brown, who was responsible for planning a revolt. And, ultimately, Jimmy got himself bought out of slavery. And, I don't want to say the rest is history because he had a lot of life to live, but wrote 3 different autobiographies, Jimmy. So,
Yes, he
I
did.
mean, that is something that at least every African-American household, again, we promote books and literacy, should have in their household. One, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which I have. One is My Bondage and Freedom, and then The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which was his last autobiography.
Well,
And
I've
in
read
it,
2 of them, Tom. I haven't read the last one, and I keep telling myself I'm going to get around to it. So I have a long list. I just haven't been reading as much in the last year or so, but I will get it taken care of. But yes,
and
if you get a chance, read all 3. It's worth the read. It's worth the time.
And in addition, of course, to fighting for the freedom of enslaved Africans, he also fought for women's suffrage
Well, the
as well.
two went hand in hand at times, Tom.
Yes,
This is why it is so silly and ridiculous to somehow imply now that somehow freedom for black people, especially that somehow black men are against women, when at that time, Tom, freedom for black people, men and women, and the women's suffrage movement went hand in hand. They worked together until maybe the 1920s.
this is true, but you have to consider that this is in the late 1800s, before women's suffrage happened in 1920. And let's be very clear, white women across this country didn't all support the freedom of African Americans, or Africans, I'll call them, in this country at that time. And so he supported women when a lot of these white women weren't particularly supporting him. Exactly.
Gotcha.
So that is a high road to travel, Jimmy. And he went from slave to freedman to writer to publisher. And ultimately became the ambassador to Haiti in the late 1800s, Jimmy. And what I also found that was quite interesting, he was, without his consent, actually nominated to be the vice president of the United States with a startup political party where there was a woman whose name I do forget, who was running for president, and they nominated him without his consent to be the vice president. That's saying a lot. But all that being said, Jimmy, he is one of the most important people, period, in American history. And when you consider the influence that he had on one Abraham Lincoln, who was fighting to
advisor to Abraham Lincoln.
He was one of the advisors to Abraham Lincoln, and having to influence a man whose primary focus was keeping the country together and making sure that he kept on the radar. Exactly. That
he wasn't for slavery, wasn't against slavery. He could take it or leave it, whether you limit it to the South or let it expand to the West territories. As long as the Union stayed together, that was his primary focus. And Tom, that's probably is the reason why he ended up becoming the nominee for the Republican Party, newly formed party at that time, because the thread was the party was to nominate a Republican who was anti-slavery. The South was going to leave the Union, which we know they ended up doing anyway, even though the Republicans nominated and elected a president who was pretty much ambivalent about slavery. But Frederick Douglass, from what I've read and from other sources, was a heavy influence on changing his mind and getting him to see the poison and the danger of slavery in the country. And that, in the end, there was only going to be one conclusion, that America was going to have to live up to her words that all men are created equal, and we're going to have to abolish slavery, which on the world stage at that time, Tom, no other nation has abolished slavery the way America did. I mean, it was bloody and it was costly. Some other nations paid their way out of slavery, like the Brits, but America had to fight its way out of slavery. And the toll from the Civil War, I don't think any other war so far has equaled that death toll.
And Jimmy, let's make it very clear. When he had that conversation with Lincoln, the Union was losing the war. And part of that announcement that Lincoln made with the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed those who were formerly enslaved to fight in the Civil War. And, Jimmy, we don't know where history might have turned if it were not for the influence for one Frederick Douglass, and obviously the ultimate announcement of Abraham Lincoln, because the Union was losing the war at that time.
Well, Tom, part of, and I find a hard time understanding the thinking during this time, but somehow Lincoln was convinced from listening to advisors that somehow black people enjoy being enslaved. And that if pushed, that they would fight for the South to maintain slavery and against the North, which we know that in the end that proved to not be true. And when blacks actually were allowed to fight in the war, the ones who fought and supported the South were forced to. Now, let's not say that any of them volunteered and raised their hand to go fight for the Confederate. But we know the enormous contribution of the black soldiers to the Union Army.
Right, Jimmy. And so with that being said, ultimately, of course, we know that he was one of the not most important black figures, but one of the most important historical figures in the history of the United States of America. He passed in 1895 and lived probably the equivalent of about at least 2 or 3 lives in one life.
Yeah, very rich life, Tom. Not rich in money necessarily, but rich in experience.
You are right, Jimmy. And I think with that leads us, I think, to a great transition to another thing that we need to discuss, which is the 1619 Project, Jimmy. And it is now going to be published on Hulu.
Yeah, Hulu is streaming the 1619 Project documentary. And so if you didn't read if you didn't read the book, or if you haven't seen the documentary, go out and take a chance. And take the time to actually look at it for yourself. Form your own opinion about the message. Some of the message, in fact, quite a bit of it, I don't agree with personally. It's not that's not my body of politics. But I do think, Tom, that is worthy of an intellectual debate in the
I would
arena
agree.
of public ideas.
I would
So,
agree.
it's something that we should talk about. I think Eric Holder, when he was Attorney General, said America was not ready for a conversation about race. I strongly disagree with him. I think race is something we should talk about and talk about quite frequently until we don't have to talk about it anymore, Tom.
Well,
To
Jimmy,
pretend that we don't have a racial problem is not the way to deal with racial problems.
I think that there are certain people who are not prepared to deal with the conversation of race in this country. I think that there are a lot of folks who are, but I think there are certain groups of people, and some of them have a significant amount of power, who do not have the capacity to have an intelligent conversation about race. I mean, it's something that Dr. Martin Luther King said and is known for, being able to disagree without being disagreeable, breaking out guns, knives, and things of that nature. But Jimmy, this is, I think, the book, which is the basis of what we talk, the
Yeah,
1619 Project. And I believe there is a 6-part series that is going to be published on Hulu. Is that out yet, Jimmy?
I believe so. I've seen the Hulu advertising it,
Mhm.
so I'm not sure if they started the series yet. But if
Right.
you haven't, if you stream Hulu, go out there, record it, sign up for it, pay attention to the dates that it's playing, and please, by all means, go out and watch it.
Right. This book was created, or really the project created by Nicole Hannah Jones. Gotten a lot of hot water with a lot of folks, and I think ended up losing her post at the university she was at the time. But Jimmy,
But
this
that's
is
unfortunate. That should have happened.
yeah,
Like I said, I don't agree with all the assertions. Some of the truth was stretched a little bit to me, in my opinion. But Tom, that's just it. A lot of this is very subjective. There's no hard code facts a lot of times when you're dealing with history. It's kind of a soft edge, and a lot of it is up to interpretation. And we're really speculating on how people thought and their attitudes and their views at that time. So it's hard to overlay our sense of sensitivities on people from 200 or 300 years ago. They thought differently, they felt differently, and so didn't necessarily always make them wrong, but doesn't make them always make them right. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, and Tom, it's a very soft areas, not hard lines. So she should have not have lost her job over this. I think it's an enormous contribution for someone to have the courage to put something like this together. And like I said, in the end, Tom, if it brings out a worthy public discussion, then it was worth it. I mean, this is something we should talk about. We should iron out as many details as possible. And maybe the first go around, we don't get it 100% correct. Maybe the second and third iteration of it, we get a little closer to the truth. But at least we're talking about it and hopefully expanding each other's knowledge.
Well, Jimmy, I think you bring up some very, very salient points there, and it is interesting in terms of fact versus fiction. I mean, if we look at American history as it actually happened versus as it was written, or even if we look at world history as it is written in this country versus what actually happened, there's a lot of conversation on what is fact versus what is fiction and what is very creative in the interpretation of history. And unfortunately, in our body of work, in our schools, even in academia, there is a lack of substantive history and facts on the role that our ancestors have played throughout world history, throughout American history. It is either absolutely not there or very creative in terms of what happened. I mean, there are some in this country who would lead you to believe that our ancestors somehow enjoyed slavery for 300 years because it saved us from, what they consider to be a backwards country that they went to, found education, found civilizations, found some of the greatest contributions of human history, took that, I'll call it, rebranded it, for lack of going into a long intellectual discourse, built economies on the human capital, on the mineral wealth of a country that obviously had nothing to contribute. And so the people from that country who built literally Europe from the ground up and built their economies, built their national defense, Jimmy, and there is no contribution of that body of work in those group of people. So when I think you're right. It is definitely worthy of a lot of intellectual discourse, and there's got to be more fact finding. But for a lot of our children, they don't see a lot of themselves and the contributions of their ancestors in our history books, and that's the problem. And that's why projects like this have to happen. And they
Well, let's do it, Tom. It's unfortunately there's two extremes on both sides. So I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of the, and I'm not going to sit here and debate the facts of 1619 because they got a lot of the facts right. So let's not say that that factually a lot of the information is wrong. It's not, but it's the context. I like to say it's the middle ground where you have to put the information to in order to understand its proper context. Like for instance, slavery did not start here in America in 1619. Slavery was a global institution.
Correct.
Every nation in the world, just about around the world, had slavery or some form of it, some serfdom or some hierarchy system. The British people had their lords, their dukes, their contessors. They had their serfs and their sirs and madams. I mean, it was always a ranking system, or if they didn't have a slavery system, they had something so close to slavery that it was almost indistinguishable. And a lot of nations had laws in the books legalizing slavery, even if they didn't have it at that period of time. But all systems had slavery. So we need to make sure that we don't paint the picture that America was the birthplace of slavery.
It was
not to say that the events that you outline you didn't chronicle them correctly, but if you don't put in the proper context and say, okay, this was slavery in America, but slavery existed around the world. Correct. And a lot of times slavery wasn't based on race or racism or prejudice. People voluntarily opted into slavery a lot of times, or indentured servitude, in order to come to America and get a start. They sold off 5 to 7 years of their life to get a chance to come here. And so, Tom, initially, the country ended up going to a system of permanent slavery, not because of racism, not because of color, but it was because of money. They needed money to maintain a nation, to keep from being overrun by the Brits or the French or the Portuguese. And the quickest way to build wealth in America was to have some free labor. Sugar, cotton became cash crops. And so, like I said, you have to put what historically happened in the context of what was going on. And don't necessarily paint that, hey, people came here with the sole intention, or made it seem like this is all just about enslaving black people. Because truth be known, more white people were enslaved by Africans, raiders, and raided the southern part and eastern part of Europe, than were blacks enslaved and sent to America during the period of slavery here. In fact, the word slavery comes from the word Slav, which were the white Europeans that Africans actually enslaved. So, like I said, it would have been nice if the 1619 Project documentary had put all of this in its proper context so people could understand a bigger picture. But like I said, maybe the second, the third, fourth iteration of this, and we have some public debate about what was going on, not to try to white coat it or sugarcoat it, but only to say, hey, here's what we did. These are our sins against humanity, but here's what was going on around the world, which didn't make it seem to people then that this was a sin against humanity. Slavery was just something that was accepted. And unfortunately, if you got caught up in it, it was unfortunate for you. But it wasn't necessarily geared towards race. Now, what made it geared towards race was Thomas Jefferson. He did publish what people thought was a scientific paper that explained slavery in a sense that black people were inferior, they were subhuman, and that changed the entire consciousness of a lot of white people about slavery. At that time, the sentiment really people started to believe, because Thomas Jefferson was such a major influence. He was a voice. So if he wrote a scientific paper explaining how black people were subhuman, a lot of people believed that time, and that really set the stage for what we call modern day racism today to explain slavery. And even after slavery ended, this sentiment still continued to exist that black people are somehow less than human.
And I think that is part of the point that is made in this book. It is the framework of slavery that was used in this country, because we understand that slavery is as old as practically human history
Yes, it
itself.
is.
And so the essays that are written in this book, the 1619 Project, they talk about the influence, of course, of slavery and how it manifested itself in so many different ways in medicine, in government, in music, and all of these other different types of things. Now, you bring up a very good point, Jimmy, when you talk about the specific construct of how it became so entrenched on the ancestors of African Americans or African ancestors, and you talk about how that whole construct is built. There's another book, Jimmy, Stamped from the Beginning, that you and I are both familiar with. It kind of
Yes.
speaks to some of the history of that. Well, it goes back to the earlier period, much earlier than pre-Columbian periods, in terms of the whole construct of what some folks call white supremacy, racism, depending on who you're talking to. So this is another book, that is worth reading and having some intellectual discourse about. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram, Ibram X period Kendi, Kendi, who talks about some of that history. And it is definitely worthy of the read. They are both relatively good books. They're both relatively long books, but again, definitely worthy of broadening your scope of what's going on there, Jimmy. And then for those who want to talk about, the presence of Africans, before Columbus came here, there's of course the calamity.
Definitely on our list.
The Ivan
The
Van Sertima.
1619 project may not have been on our top 100 list. It was years ago we did that list, but the other two were definitely on our list. So definitely must read them.
And so Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus is something that should definitely be on the library, in the libraries of every home in America.
Not just Columbus, but even what we consider indigenous Americans today. We were here before them. So
exactly. And so these are the things that, quite frankly, you're not going to find in your typical libraries at school. And, Jimmy, that kind of brings us to our next story, and that is homeschooling and the number of increases in the homeschooling for Black families across America, Jimmy. And so this has been very interesting. I think the pandemic that basically shut down a lot of schools across this country, across the world, created, for lack of a better term, a perfect storm. And the statistics, I think, that I found show that pre-pandemic, Jimmy, I think 3% of Black households were homeschooling their children, but by 2021, that has gone up to 16%, Jimmy. And that's
good, Tom. I'm glad you found some stats on that. I'm amazed that the number is that high, but it needs to be even higher. To either to accept responsibility for your children's education by doing it yourself, or definitely staying involved in managing the process if you send them off to a school. Do not just delegate that authority and responsibility to the school and wash your hands of it.
Yeah, Jimmy. I mean, I know some people, some friends that I went to college with, and other people who are relatively close to me who have homeschooled their children. And I mean, there are some very interesting stats. I don't know, it may be a few more years before the statistics are more comprehensive in terms of, what that leads to in terms of overall performance in academia, that is, in higher education, things of that nature. So there's probably going to be a few more years of body of work, considering that homeschooling has been around for a long time, but if we narrow it down to the impact it is having in our schools in particular, it's going to be a very interesting narrative, Jimmy, because, a lot of families, mothers and fathers, are taking their children out of traditional schools and putting them into homeschool environments because their children just aren't getting the attention that
sure,
they
Tom. The quality of the education of the public school system in some places is terrible.
It is. It is, unfortunately, Jimmy. And in addition to that, a lot of them feel that, they're, to our earlier points, their children are not getting as comprehensive an education, especially when it comes to the history books. There's very little that speaks to or looks like them in their history, when we know that our ancestors enslaved, and freed were all over our history books, but
Yeah.
unfortunately were never written into our history books. That narrative are not in the history books, and so that does not elevate and enrich not just Black students, but white students, Indian, Asian students, Latin American students, et cetera. And so they don't feel, in a lot of cases, the parents, that their kids are getting the benefit of the doubt. Their history, their self-identity is not being inflated like other children are, Jim.
You get Harriet Tubman in slavery, and then you get Martin Luther King and civil rights. That's the extent of your Black history that you're going to get in the public school system.
That's about it, unfortunately, Jimmy. And, the teachers, on the most part, don't look like them. If you have Black men in school, usually they are the coach and they may be teaching a history course, but you don't have a lot of Black men or nowhere close to a lot of Black men. We know this, Jimmy. Our kids usually are going to also be disciplined at significantly higher rates than other children in the school.
Well,
and so
you're saying discipline, but now we've covered stories where Black kids have been handcuffed. Police have been called on them and arrested for doing less things than their white counterparts.
Correct. It's been atrocious what we've seen, Jimmy. Literally, we've seen young Black girls get body slammed by law enforcement officers. It's unimaginable what we're seeing, Jimmy, but it'll be very interesting to see what this looks like in another 10 or so years. And then the other story is, what is going to be happening or what will be the state of affairs in public schools, because that's where the majority of our kids, African-American children, current date, are being educated. And so the question is the balancing act.
You want to improve any system, you have to introduce competition into the formula, to the recipe.
Right.
And that's why I'm a big proponent for homeschoolers. Like my mother homeschooled her grandchildren, but she didn't get paid for it. So I'm all for the money following the child. If you homeschool your child or send your child to someone to be homeschooled, then let the money follow the child. Let the person who's doing the educating get paid that money rather than the school district. And if you do that, Tom, as long as the kids are progressing every year, passing whatever state exam they have to show that they're getting a quality education, then they can stay in the program. Now, if you're just going to put the money in your pocket and not educate your children, and they're going to remain dumb, then obviously, we shouldn't allow that to continue more than a year. So every year you have to test and maintain your status as a, educator or education provider. But let the money follow the student. And when school districts start losing money and funding, they'll either find a way to improve their service or they'll go out of business. And I'm okay with either one of those.
Yep, Jimmy. But again, as we've talked about so many times on our show, education starts at home. Yes, obviously, our teachers and our administrators, they do have a job, but the first teachers of our children are their parents. And so at a very early age, Jimmy, we have to make sure that we're nourishing them with not just the right physical food, but the right intellectual food.
True.
It should be at a minimum a 3-pod stool of the student, the parent, and the educator. And then obviously the community is an overlay to that, Jimmy. And every household in America should have their own library that caters to the needs of their children, because unfortunately, especially for our children, we cannot expect, or nor have we seen an education systems that caters to the needs of our children, not just in the history books, not just in the social science books, but every facet of that. And parents do have to be involved in the PTA.
Correct a little bit here. We did see urban prep in Chicago to Black boys and do what the experts said couldn't be done. If you keep Black boys in preschool and Head Start, and they grew up in 2-parent households. Correct. By 6th grade, they were pretty much destined for prison and drug life or the graveyard. But we saw Brother King with Urban Prep take high school boys and make sure that parents understand that you have to be involved, accept some responsibility for this. We can't do it by ourselves. Tom, tough discipline and they have 100% graduation rates, 100% kids going to college, 84% graduating college. That was a huge success. And of course, where's Urban Prep today? Chicago school system is shutting them down. Shut them down, Tom.
Yeah, Jimmy, and unfortunately, that is the rare exception
Oh yeah.
in our community. So that's maybe 1%, if even 1% of our schools that are educating our children that truly caters to the needs of our children.
Tom, it's
Educate and elevate.
1%. That number is so close to zero that statistically it's not even a number. So,
Yep. So all that being said, Jimmy, I think that's something that is going to be a growing statistic in our community. The homeschooling.
very good. I'm glad to see that you found some stats and showing that number growing, Tom. I was concerned that it wasn't growing, but 16%, yeah, we need to get up to 32% and then 82% at some point. Until these schools decide they're going to educate our kids properly and take our input, then yeah, Tom, keep your child at home and educate your children yourself.
Correct. And at the end of the day, Jimmy, it's holding those who are educating our children accountable, and that education starts with us. That's not to say, Jimmy, that we have to all be professional science teachers, math teachers, but we do have to own the education of our children and make sure that we have a relationship with those who are educating our children, making sure that we hold them accountable, and that, of course, starts at home.
Well, Tom, we just did the story. I forget the young man's name who graduated high school at 9 years old, who was homeschooled. Well, it just goes to show that when your kids are in an environment that's feeding them healthy education, what they're capable of. So if he can do it, Tom, I'm pretty sure other kids, maybe not graduate high school at 9 years old, but can certainly graduate high school early and get a better education than sitting in the public school where people are not educating you.
And by the way, Jimmy, that young man was homeschooled. His name was David I believe it's pronounced Balogun, Balogun, David Balogun, but he was a 9-year-old. He was homeschooled and he was able to advance, much like Frederick Douglass. He wants to be an astrophysicist. He, took the bull by the horns and fast-tracked his education and graduated high school at 9 years old. When we got kids, Jimmy, who are 18, 19 plus years old. But again, a lot of that has to do with the environment.
Who you telling, Tom? I'm not going to say much. I was just getting ready to say something about my offspring, but yeah, I'll keep it to myself.
All right, Jimmy. Now, talking about content, stuff in books, found an interesting story that just happened in the last week. The very, very well-known actor Idris Elba is going to be helping to build a film studio in Ghana. I believe he has 2 partners, but he has talked to the head of state of the country of Ghana in West Africa, and they are building a film studio in Ghana, and they expect to shoot their first film, if things work out right, Jimmy, as soon as December of this year.
Well, Tom, we've talked about this so many times before. As much money as Black people spend on movie tickets, I still believe we're the largest group supporting the movie industry. So we need content from Black filmmakers. We need more. We have a few. We had some that had a little success, but we need more time to tell our story. I'm so sick and tired of studios telling our story with a white happy ending. Not that I'm necessarily opposed to white people being the hero, but they certainly can't be the hero, Tom, of all of our stories. At some point, our stories have to involve a Black hero somewhere in a Black story. And if you have to embellish the truth a little bit to make it happen, I'd rather you do that than to continue to whitewash our Black story with white heroes.
Well, Jimmy, we talk about embellishing the facts in order to tell a story. That is the motion picture industry, isn't it?
Yes, it truly is. So, but sometimes, Tom, there are silly people out there who will say, well, that's not really a true Black holiday. Like, okay, what is really a real holiday versus a fake holiday when you're talking about Kwanzaa? Or, the people I've heard say, oh, well, the story about the tribe with the African queen.
We're talking about are we talking about the recent film, or are we talking about the The Amazon.
No, it wasn't Amazon. It was in Africa. It was an African tribe, but they had a woman queen.
Gotcha.
And how many silly people out there saying, well, they got the historical facts wrong. This tribe was actually slave raided, and they.
Are we talking about the Dogon tribe?
Yes.
Yes.
So my point is that, okay, so what? They embellish the truth a little bit. The point is that it's a black story with a black hero in the movie. So that's worth at least watching and supporting. It couldn't be any worse than Tarzan, a white person, left in the jungle, and he's able to be raised by the apes and be king of the jungle. All the animals respect him and follow his direction. And black folks have been there all since the beginning of mankind, and the apes don't seem to somehow embrace them.
And Jimmy, these same folks getting killed in our zoos in America, but when they go to Africa, somehow they're controlling the entire forest or the entire country. No, I don't see that, Jimmy.
Or if you get a John A by King Kong, he just happens to fall in love with who? The white lady.
Yeah, this is true.
All those
Jimmy, and what's wrong with this? You got all these fine sisters in Africa, but
that's what I said. Yes, you overlook all of them, but that white woman that came over in the boat, that's the one he fell in love with.
But Jimmy, unfortunately, that is very symbolic of what was going on. And I don't know, this may be a conspiracy theorist at the time, but some people say that was somewhat of a iconic representation of the Jack Johnson story, of course, at the time, who was the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. Of course, we know he married a white woman, and of course,
that was his second time.
Exactly. A lot of folks were not happy about that. And so that was, from my understanding, part of the inspiration behind the original King Kong film.
It wasn't just a sin, Tom. It was a crime to marry a white woman and take her across state lines. Mm-hmm. As if you were trafficking drugs or something.
Exactly.
He was better off trafficking drugs than trafficking a white woman that he was married to.
Correct. But not getting off track too much. But he has two partners, from my understanding, Tony Tego and Danny Damar, when he sat down with the president of Ghana to talk about the project and what he wanted to do for West Africa. And really, I think he said the key thing is, there's a lot of creativity and talent.
Yes.
The issue are the facilities and the capital in order to get it done. And so, we want to definitely take our hats off and give kudos to Idris Elba to starting a movement. I think there may be other studios coming to Ghana, Jimmy, but someone has to take the first step. And we have to own our own content. And we need to have, as in anything else, completely integrated industries where we're controlling everything from top to bottom. That's the only way that we're going to benefit our community, create jobs, for our people, make sure that we are benefiting from the things that we consume.
But Tom, I hope other nations, including this one, use this as an example. So I'm glad to see that Ghana is invested in this project. I don't know what their contribution is, but whatever it was to make it happen, more power to them. We need more black studios, and we need more black content. That's not to say that we're against white content or Latino content. We're not against any other content. We need more produced and more content telling our stories, whether they're real or fiction, but more of it need to come to the screens, Tom, and come to be available to the public.
Exactly, Jimmy. It's pretty much what everybody else, does. And we have to focus on only consume what you control, Jimmy.
Yes.
Only consume what you control. That's the only way that you're going to build your own economy.
Very powerful group. So we got to be careful with that message, because there's some people don't like us telling the truth on this show. They think possible to shut us down and to keep us small, but that is very true and very powerful what you just said. If you consume what you produce, Tom, you can generate a great deal of wealth and power.
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy. And so, again, kudos to Idris Elba. We'll be supporting you. And, whatever film that looks like, Jimmy, again.
Whatever it comes out with, Tom, I'm supporting it. Even if it's not very good in the beginning, but by supporting it and keeping them going, hopefully they will be. I'm just assuming that maybe it won't be good quality, but hey, I could be wrong. It'd be really great quality from the start. He's a great actor. I think he's done some directing, so let's just give them a chance. But I'm just saying we all need to support the effort, Tom. Good, bad, or indifference, we still need to support it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Jimmy. And of course, we can't get through this show, Jimmy, without talking about a little bit of what happened this past Sunday with Super Bowl 57. It was I don't know if you got a chance to watch the Super Bowl this past weekend, Jimmy, but it was a pretty
I watched
doggone
the second half of the time. I didn't watch the whole game. I just watched it. Well, by the time
you watched probably the best part of the game, Jimmy.
I
I mean,
did.
you probably caught up with whatever happened. I don't really do halftime shows, but Rihanna, and hey, hats off to you. Obviously, you got a nice big check for that.
Yeah,
But if we look at the takeaways from this Super Bowl, the uniqueness of this Super Bowl, one of the better Super Bowls that I've seen in a while, Jimmy. Obviously, we had for the first time in the 100-year history of professional football, we had two African-American quarterbacks. Starting, obviously, the first to quarterback was, and I just thought of his name and just missed his name, former coach of Grambling, former quarterback of Grambling.
Doug Williams, yes, with the Washington Redskins.
Who was that?
Doug Williams.
There you go, the great Doug Williams.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the first starting black quarterback for a Super Bowl team was Doug Williams, and just nailed it. And then obviously we have Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts going head to head in Super Bowl 57. There's a lot to take away, but we have to keep it short. What's that?
Two class acts.
Two class acts, Jimmy, and both of them, again, underrated. Coming out of college, nobody really gave them that much of a chance. Of course, Patrick Mahomes came out first. His whole style of quarterbacking, of course, he could have gone pro baseball or football, but, the analysts didn't like the way he threw the ball. They didn't like, the way he approached the game because it wasn't typical of the prototypical NFL quarterback. And so they said
Tom, they didn't run a pro style offense like you see a lot of schools do in the SEC. So, they figure those quarterbacks that come out of pro systems in college can transition to the NFL a little better. But you're right. The Raiders had a very wildcat style offense with what's his name? Eric Moon used to run down in Houston when he came from the CFL.
Warren Moon.
Yeah, Warren Moon. So you're right. A lot of the analysts, had knocks against Malone, but we have seen that with the right coach who understands how to get the most out of his quarterback, Tom, don't discourage him from playing and delivering however he needs to get the ball there. He has that freedom. And I have never seen him walk to the sideline and the coaches, dropping pads and in his face and, making, a big stink about something he just did or called or decided or a throw that he made. So great kudos to the Chiefs, to their coach for the halftime adjustments, because really I didn't think they were going to be able to come back on the Eagles the way they did. And then, kudos to the Eagles coach, for accepting the loss graciously, by not being a sourpuss and blaming the holding call on the ref. That's for why they lost the game, Tom. But I would like to say I really dislike the what I saw afterwards from the fans of Philadelphia with the rioting. That's not called for. Sports is not that important where you need to be destroying people's property and potential harming people's lives over a damn game. It's just that. It's a game for entertainment.
Yeah, Jimmy. And let's deal with the elephant in the room. We know whose folks this probably isn't because we know they probably would have gotten arrested. They probably would have got tased. They would have got handcuffed and everything else. But, Jimmy, it is a game. It's for enjoyment. I mean, it's a child's game. But, at the end of the day, some folks do not understand that. But getting back to the greatness of Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, because Jalen Hurts yeah, both of them played a very good game. It really came down to, mistakes. And if there were very few of them, there weren't a lot of penalties. I think the Chiefs had 3 penalties. The Philadelphia Eagles had 6 penalties. Patrick Mahomes had like a 96.4 QBR, Jimmy. And that's what he injured his leg again during the game. He only had 182 yards, which is not very good when you look at
Well,
Patrick Mahomes' greatest games.
the running game got cranked up, which helped with some of the pressure from him having to deliver throws. But he did come through and make some key throws on third and fourth.
And a few key runs, Jimmy.
Yeah, and the key runs, yes.
And so when you look at it, if you look at the statistics, with the exception of the fumble and the pickup touchdown, Jimmy, actually statistically, Jalen Hurts had a better game, over 300 yards for Jalen Hurts versus just about 180 yards with Patrick Mahomes. I think 44 yards Patrick Mahomes, including that one very long run by Patrick Mahomes. Jalen Hurts had 3 running touchdowns to Patrick Mahomes' 3 passing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts had 1 passing touchdown. And, I mean, they had the ball, that is Philadelphia, 36 minutes versus the Chiefs only having the ball 24. If you looked at it statistically, with the exception of that turnover, Jimmy, it looks like the Eagles would have actually won this game, Jimmy. But, you know, there's something about that doggone Patrick Mahomes when it comes to big games. He shows up. And in this one, Jimmy, Jalen Hurts showed up too.
That's true, Tom. The biggest thing is that the Chiefs made adjustments at halftime.
Brilliant.
The Eagles, so the Eagles defense, I mean, the offense scored enough points to put them in contention to win the game. Their defense totally let them down in the second half. And I don't know if how much of that you can attribute to the decline, the fall of the Eagles defense, or the advanced play, the better play of the Chiefs offense, or a combination, combination of both. But, you know, let's face it, you know, Jalen Hurts did his job. It put them in contention to win the game.
And I think,
unfortunately, he didn't have a defense that could hold a lead from there. So
I would agree with you, Jimmy. I would say this. Quite frankly, the Chiefs outcoached the Eagles in the second half of this game. I can't put it any other way. Jalen Hurts had that fumble in the early part of the first half, and they were still leading by 10 points at halftime. You had a very long halftime, I think 29 minutes total, and so that was a lot of time for them to make some adjustments at halftime. Their defense couldn't seem to do anything in the Chiefs defense, you know, was very porous in the first half. In the second half, they locked down. In the second half, the Chiefs clamped down and strengthened their running game. And that young Pacheco, I can't remember that young cat's name, but that guy was running like reckless abandon. And they just, quite frankly, outcoached the Eagles in the second half of the game.
A lot of those runs were on the inside between the tackles. They were dicing and slicing, but yeah, they got the running game cranked up. And the defense for the Chiefs made a point to force Jalen Hurts to his left when they flushed him out of the pocket every time. They had to overload the right side and flush him to the left. That's what they did, Tom. Like I said, they made all the adjustments they had to. Their defense put them in contention to hold the Eagles scoring down, while the offense got the scoring game cranked up. The Eagles defense just didn't do enough. And unfortunately, there's only so much that Jalen Hurts can do for the most part to put them, like I said, he put them in contention to win the game, which is all you can ask from your quarterback.
And at the end of the game, Jimmy, you know, Andy Reid, he called it right. I mean, some folks were saying, you know, you need to go ahead. Again, he called it right. He held out, ate up the time until there was literally no time left for Jalen Hurts in order to get back in the game, because it looked like it was going to come down to whoever had the ball last was going to win the game. Exactly. Yeah. So,
and the ball certainly helped because without that, Eagles probably would have got the ball back with a minute and a half left, minute 40 seconds left. I don't know how much time, based on what they had done that whole second half, that they could do with that little time left to march down the field. Will be asking a lot when you hadn't really done it but once, maybe twice in the second half. So the Eagle defense, the Chiefs defense seemed to have had the Eagles number by that point. So I don't know how much realistic they could have done, but it would have been nice if they had been given a chance. So they either not make that call or pick the flag up and say a no call and just let it play out at that point, I think would have been the most prudent thing to do.
Yeah, Jimmy. I mean, it's a hard call. It was a penalty, and this defensive back, you know, he owned up to it, Jimmy. And
he did own up to it. It was slight though, Tom. But But really, was it enough to really interfere with the play? I don't think so. But, I mean, by the time the receiver made his cut, I think the ball would have been overthrown anyway. I'm
Right.
not sure he would have got there with or without the hole. But it'd been nice to at that point to just make a no call and let it go game go ahead and play out because time was running out. And that was a play that one got you 5 yards closer to the end zone and got you a new set of downs.
That's true. Very true, Jimmy. For those who are out there, as we have a few minutes left in the show, if you haven't done so, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure we get that business taken care of, Jimmy. And now we're going to transition to the last few minutes that we have to honor those who we have lost in 2023. We said we were going to commit to doing this on a regular basis, Jimmy, and we've definitely had some folks who we have lost. So a few who I knew, but a few who I wasn't quite aware of, Jimmy. So let's take a few minutes to honor those who we have lost. Probably most recently, Jimmy, I don't know if you remember the R&B group De La Soul, but one of the co-founders and lead rappers, Trugoy the Dove, his formal government name was David Jude Jalocoeur, I believe is his pronounced name. But this is the De La Soul, Jimmy, for anybody who's probably at least in their upper 30s, maybe 40s for sure. They remember the song Me, Myself, and I.
Right.
So he was one of the co-founders of that group, just passed this past week at 50 years of age, definitely a Gen Xer. And so we want to send our condolences out to his family. I think that was amongst a group of folks within the R&B genre that definitely very missed, and definitely our condolences to his family and those, of course, in the entertainment community for his loss. Jimmy, this was another one that I had no idea about. The great Charles White, former USC running back standout and Heisman Trophy winner.
I knew Charles White, yes.
I did not know that Charles White had passed.
Yeah, I didn't know either until you told me. It seemed like that kind of news kind of flew under the radar because I read keep up with the news, latest news. I didn't hear anyone talk about it. So,
but he
yeah.
Obviously a great one of the greatest.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the greatest college running backs out there. Played in the NFL for 8 years with the Rams and the Cleveland Browns. He died in I think January the 11th at the age of 64. And I don't know why I didn't see this on the news because he is one of the greats for sure in college history and was a great pro running back as well. Also, we want to, of course, send our condolences out to his family, even though this has been a few weeks ago. There is Barrett Story, who was a singer-songwriter for Motown and actually sang and wrote one of their greatest hits, the first Motown hit in 1959 called Money. That's What I Want, Money. So we want to definitely send our condolences out. All of these folks are now with the ancestors. And then one of my favorite groups, Jimmy, Fred White, who was the former drummer of what I would consider to be among, if not the greatest R&B band of all time, Earth, Wind, and Fire, passed at the very beginning of the year at the tender age of 67 years old. So we definitely want to send our condolences out to his family. And again, we are catching up for January up through February, folks who we have not taken time to acknowledge and honor into the land of our ancestors.
Our time was great, but you get a little bit of argument from me on the greatest of all time.
Who is that now?
Temptations.
Oh yeah, Temptations. Yeah, my dad would probably say that they're the greatest, and he grew up during that generation of crooners. Of course, I grew up a little bit later than that, and so I knew the Temptations, but my father grew up on the Temptations. But going back to that era, Gordy Harmon, who was one of the founding members of the Whispers, passed at 79 years of age.
Oh, I love the Whispers too. Yes, I got a chance to see them in concert when I was a little kid, but yeah, I love the Whispers.
Yes, Jimmy. And so the Whispers, definitely of that era of crooners, one of the most melodic singers and bands during that period of time, Jimmy. And so we definitely want to honor him and send our condolences to his family. And Jimmy, that is what I have for today in terms of those that we have lost and who have transitioned to the land of our ancestors.
But Tom, I'm going to add one more to the list. It's not a black person. It's
Okay.
actually a white Jewish person,
Okay.
Bert Baccarat. And Tom, the reason I'm kind of adding him to the list, sort of making him honorary soul brother. Here's the thing, Tom. I've heard the name before. I knew who he was. I did not know he was a white Jewish person. I always thought he was a black person who was passing. His contribution to soul music, Tom, and R&B was just astronomical for me. And then this is another thing, Tom. It makes this whole appropriating someone's culture silly, because as you pointed out when we were talking before, so much of our music was written and produced by and composed by some white people. Some white people made a contribution to our music. Bird was one of those people, Tom. Just about every hit from Dionne Warwick, he wrote and produced, composed. But also wrote for the Jackson 5 and the Isley Brothers, Isaac Hayes, and many other greats, Tom. And when I looked through his cover to see the music that he's responsible for, it's like, wait a minute. This is a lot of music that I have grown to love, accept, and appreciate. I did not realize that a non-black person actually composed and wrote this stuff. So we got to be careful when we start claiming stuff, as if someone is stealing it from us. Because, Tom, there's a lot of our culture that was influenced by other people who are not black. So I want to do a little shout out to Bird and his family for his great contribution to our culture.
All right. Touche and kudos, Jimmy. There we have it. Wednesday, February the 15th, 2023. If we know it's Wednesday night.
Yes, it's definitely Black Men Speak, and we hope to see you back next week. Same time, same channel.
Thank you, everyone.